Okay, cool. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. As you've been invited to, this is our new academic editor welcome webinar, and this is for the journals PLOS One, Climate, Global Public Health, Mental Health, and Water. So I really appreciate your time today. This is what we're going to cover in the day. Daniel and I are going to briefly introduce ourselves. We'll give you a chance to fill out a poll just to get a sense of who and where you're all calling in from today. And then the bulk of our webinar is going to just be going over the roles and responsibilities of an academic editor, and then very critically, where to find the resources that we have available to you. Because realistically, you're probably anywhere along the time span of your journey into being an academic editor. And so these resources are meant to be just kind of, or this webinar is meant to be just a broad exposure to the resources that we have available to you so that you know where to find the documentation that you need to reference at that point in time. And then, as I mentioned, we have a Q&A session at the end, and then we'll kind of wrap up everything. And then if you're so inclined, we could do a breakout meeting setup or stay in the main thing and just kind of socialize. Kind of think of it like a conference, after there's a presentation, you kind of have a little chit chat and then you'll just log off. But that's totally optional. Kind of depends on how much time that we have at the remainder of the presentation. All right, so without further ado, getting into introductions. Hi, I'm Dina Emerson. You'll probably get a lot of emails from me. My title at PLOS is Editorial Board Experience Manager, and I'm on a very unique team at PLOS that's dedicated exclusively to editorial board members. So that's recruitment, onboarding and training, handling resignations when it does come to be that time, as well as helping with editor matching and kind of keeping papers moving along. And I'm based in San Francisco, and I'm going to pass it over to Daniel to introduce himself.
Cool, thank you. I'm Daniel. I am in the editorial team for One, Climate and Water, and some of the other journals I work on as well. And I'm based in London in the UK. I work in the physical science and engineering team at PLOS, but I've worked in a couple of other publishing roles elsewhere as well. So I've worked at Springer Nature and Frontiers in research integrity and handling the review process. So a little bit of experience across a few different aspects of publishing, but nothing on editor recruitment. So I'll be very happy to hear more from Dina on that as we go through. Um, Throughout my time in publishing, I separated that a bit. My background's in oceanography, so I like looking at a lot of the climate papers when they're submitted. I studied past abrupt climate events and how they related to impacts on European climates due to changes in ocean circulation. In terms of day to day, I largely do problem solving with issues in the peer review process and help maintain an ethical and ethical publishing practices and research integrity in the publishing process. So you might hear from me a lot at a decision where we might be taking a bit of extra care looking at a paper to make sure that everything's above board. You'll probably see something that says PLOS Queries Editorial Board Member and my name or my colleague's names asking me some questions to get expertise from you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I have for you all a little poll, as mentioned, and I'm going to launch. It's very three short questions. Which journal are you on the board of? Where are you calling in from? And then very critically, cats, dogs, something else entirely, or I don't really like animals that much. I'm going to give it the obligatory popcorn in the microwave amount of time. There's like a bunch of pops and then it kind of slows down towards the end. All right. Let's see. Here's what we got. Let's see. Most of you are calling in from PLOS One. To be expected, it is our largest journal. Let's see. And we have Asia, Europe, North America, and South America represented. I haven't yet had someone from Antarctica, but there will be a time. And then big fans of dogs, cats trailing in, and then others, and then none. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here today. We're very happy to have you here, and I'm glad we can kind of put a face to the many emails that we send back and forth. All right, getting into the bulk of things now. Like I said, if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat throughout. So, brief introduction to the editorial boards at PLOS. We have a broad coverage in geography, career stage, and subject areas, obviously journal dependent in terms of what those subject areas are. And just to give you a brief orientation of how to find who else is on the editorial board with you, we have examples. I've linked all of the different journal listings or the editorial board listings here. And this is what a page would look like. And you're able to actually go here and you can search. This syncs daily with Editorial Manager, so it's an up-to-date list of who's on the editorial board. And you can search by a variety of things. You can look up people by country or by section. So let's say biogeography, for example. So you can see biogeography is one of our taxonomy terms as well. And then section. So if you click this, you can see who else is in the biogeochemistry section. And so the other journals pages function very similarly to that. There's two editorial board roles. There's section editors, which are more of kind of an advisor position, and they oversee a particular section and provide kind of deeper level consulting expertise to our editorial team. And then, of course, academic editors, which you all are, which are kind of direct handling of the manuscripts. And so these next couple of slides I'm going to go over a little bit quickly because you will have seen these as part of your onboarding process. But just a reminder, the academic editor role is responsible for overseeing all of the peer review process from the moment you agree to handle a manuscript to securing reviewers, evaluating their feedback, and then actually independently issuing decisions to be sent to the authors as well. And then moving on to our code of conduct. So this is very important. As Daniel mentioned, we're very involved with publication ethics here at PLOS. We have a very large publication ethics team, and then my team in particular as well is responsible for upholding ethical handling of manuscripts. So this is also something you will have agreed to as part of your onboarding process, and it's linked there for reference. All right, getting into the meat of things, the very first of our guides is a guide to Editorial Manager, which is the submission system we use for all of our different publications. And I've linked here and have it open. This is just a screenshot guide that you'll probably want to reference when you're first getting started, but then once you get the hang of Editorial Manager, you'll probably need it less and less once you get oriented with where things are. But this is a guide here. It's just a basic presentation, but it does have links here in the table of contents. So a couple of things I want to call out. So when you get started, logging in and linking your ORCID is very important, and then being able to access your role. And then this update my information page is one you're going to want to know about. That's important if you want to update any of your contact information, if you say move institutions or would prefer to use a personal email or otherwise change your contact there. It's also where you will indicate your areas of expertise. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but our larger journals, so PLOS One and PLOS Global Public Health, use a matching algorithm, which is why you may recognize that we will have asked you for some recent publications that represent your area of expertise. But it's also important that you add classification terms as well, and especially those other journals that don't use that matching algorithm. That's how we pair editors to manuscripts, is we take a look at the manuscript and what the terms are there, and we look at an editor's profile and what the terms are there, and then is there a match, or to what degree of overlap is there. So it's very important that you review those terms and keep them up to date as your expertise changes. The last thing I want to point out on this update my information page is if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can indicate if you are going to be unavailable. So that's if you are, say, writing a grant, have a heavy teaching load, are going to be doing field work, or just otherwise would like to step away from your editorial role for a bit, you can go into Editorial Manager and add those unavailable dates. So you would just specify the time frame and then the reason that you're going to be out. And then very importantly, if you can specify that you can handle revisions or not, like if you have any papers that are out with the authors to revise, when those papers come in, are you available to continue handling those? That's really important and helpful for us in managing the peer review process. Okay, so that's it on Editorial Manager. And then going into the life of a manuscript. So this is kind of just a bird's eye view of a typical life of a manuscript. So from the initial submission here, there's a series of technical checks throughout. You'll see these here, and this is done by the journal office to really basic things like, did the authors fill out all of the fields appropriately? Did they complete the mandatory checks for our various policies? That kind of thing. Is it written in English? Like some of these very, very technical checks that they do along the way at various stages. And then we have a stage here called subscan, which is short for submission scanning. So all of the papers that are submitted actually go through an editorial check first prior to even coming to you to be invited to handle the manuscript. And we're looking for things like critical ethics adherence to our policies there. Some basic, like, is it within the scope of the journal? Is it actual science? But then beyond that, we still rely on your expertise to handle the paper because our editorial team is only so big and only has, a certain breadth of coverage of um, scientific expertise. And so we still rely on you as an academic editor to make that initial decision, which is where it would come right here. So you're invited to handle the manuscript, and you actually do have an opportunity to reject without review as well. So a lot of people will be invited to handle a manuscript and think that everything needs to go out to go to peer review. That's not the case. If you are looking at a manuscript and during your initial read through with your expertise, you can actually make that decision that that paper should not be sent out for peer review. And Daniel will go into that a little bit later of when you would consider that decision. But let's say the paper is good for peer review. You go ahead and you invite reviewers to review the paper. You get their agreement. They submit their review. You would then evaluate their feedback and you send a decision to the authors. And then the three options would be another reject at this point in time, very typically a revise. Very rarely would you go straight to accept. You're going to typically do a revise, either a minor or a major revision, and then goes back through the peer review cycle again. And then finally, you would reach a final decision. And then it would go on to either production to be published if it was accepted on our website or rejected. And then that letter would get sent to the authors. Right. So here is what you can expect in terms of a typical timeline. Now, I say this is typical because, every paper is a little bit different, but just to kind of set your expectations about how much time you should spend at each stage of the manuscript handling process, we have this helpful diagram for you here. So here's your expected handling volume. So I should say that not every paper that you're invited to do we expect you to handle. Like I said, we use a matching process. It's typically not overseen by a person, and so your volume may be really high or really low. We typically expect you to handle 1 to 2 new manuscripts per month. So please feel free to decline anything that you're not available to handle, that's not in your area of expertise, or that you otherwise just don't have the capacity to do. And then once you agree to handle a manuscript, within 2 days, that's when you're going to make your initial decision. So that's going to be either the reject without peer review, or yes, I would like to send it out for peer review. So you have 2 days to kind of sit with the manuscript, read it all the way through, and then decide what to do next. And then this is once the manuscript has come back from peer review, you've got 4 days to make your initial decision. And that's going to be whether, once you've digested the peer review feedback, are you going to issue a minor, major, reject decision? And then repeated for all of the different stages of the manuscript as it comes back from revision. Okay. And then we're getting into the first of what I call the core quick guides. So all of these, again, and we'll go over the link later, are going to be on our Editor Resource Center, which is our cross-journal hub for all of the resources that you're going to need as an academic editor. And we intend to have a guide anytime there's a decision point in your manuscript handling process. So the very first one is that you've received an invitation to handle a manuscript and you now have a decision point. Do I agree to handle this manuscript or would I like to decline this? And so we have a guide for that. So I have it open here and this is what it looks like. So it goes into a little bit of information about how invitations work that I've covered already, about importance of keeping your taxonomy terms up to date so that we can match you to papers appropriately. And another thing to expect is that you will receive invitations to handle manuscripts in your email. So there's a snippet of information within that email itself. You'll see the author's information. You'll see an abstract of the paper, so you can kind of get a quick sense of what this paper is about. But you actually, from that email, can also navigate to Editorial Manager to download the full submission if you want to take a closer look at it before deciding if it's in your area of expertise or not. And so you want to consider to agree to handle an invitation if you have enough time. That's very important because, these processes can take some time. So kind of weigh your capacity in that sense. Obviously, if it falls within your area of expertise. Now, a quick note on that is it doesn't need to be like perfectly within your wheelhouse. It may be on the fringes of your area of expertise. But if you feel you know enough about that manuscript's topic to be able to identify and secure relevant reviewers, then you can consider accepting to handle that manuscript. And obviously, if you don't have any competing interests, like if you know the authors, if you've worked with them within the last 5 years, you're going to want to decline that manuscript invitation. And then this last bit here is like if you think a manuscript is not suitable for peer review, but it's still within your area of expertise, you can still consider agreeing to handle that manuscript and then issuing that reject without review decision that I mentioned earlier. So something to keep in mind. And then basically decline the invitation if it's the opposite of all of those things. And then just some kind of further disclaimers here, or just something to help you set your expectations. How to identify those manuscripts within your email. They're always going to start with PLOS in all caps, so they're pretty easy to pick out. Check your spam folder or Outlook kind of does that like focused inbox thing. So if you're not receiving invitations, just check your other inboxes and make sure that you whitelist the emails that come from Editorial Manager or PLOS. And then also the different things I mentioned about navigating into Editorial Manager. And you'll notice in the invitations, they also say that we encourage you to respond within 24 hours. And I recognize that that's a pretty quick turnaround and that you are busy. And it's more of like an aim to not like, we're going to come after you if you don't click on something within those 24 hours. So just to kind of keep the manuscript process moving. All right, and now at this point, I'm actually going to pass it over to Daniel, who's going to take over the screen share and he's going to go into some deeper editorial content.
Cool. I'm just. Oh, my screen share option has just disappeared. I was about to. Sorry, it's because you were sharing it now. Right, that should be up. Can everyone see that? I hope so. Adina, can you see that? Great. So, Dina's just gone over a little bit of this at the start, but when you've accepted a manuscript, the first thing you need to do is decide whether or not this is suitable for peer review. By and large, manuscripts will come to you before they've received any reviewers, but there are some instances where perhaps for whatever reason another editor is unable to handle a manuscript and a manuscript may come to you after it's received reviewers. Regardless of the case, we encourage you to perform an initial check on whether or not this is suitable to go towards review, and some of the reasons you might not let it go to review are what we're going to go over a bit on this slide. So if you were to search online for PLOS's publication criteria, you might reject if a manuscript did not meet our criteria for publication, and you can find this is what the authors see. If you have submitted to PLOS 1, you may have reviewed this as well, but we have several different aspects of our criteria for publication where, for example, if it doesn't represent any advance at all, or if the experiments aren't repeatable or described in sufficient detail, that might be something that we can reject for before review. But we also will include some information that might be useful to you in, sorry, this is my floating meeting controls. Just going to hide those. There we are. We also may include some information for you to keep an eye on, where you may not want to act on as well. So on the details tab of the editorial manager page, you may see something that we've left a note for you as well regarding the manuscript, and you may decide that you act on that as well, on whether or not to reject before review or whether or not to monitor later on in the review process. That's a fair bit of information, but we do have a nice link to go through, which has all of this there for you as editors. So as I say, when a manuscript comes to you, you want to assess whether or not it can move towards review, or whether or not it should be rejected in line with not meeting our publication criteria. And that's, as Dina said, a common misconception amongst editors: you don't have to send everything to review. The main thing that you should consider is that we shouldn't be rejecting for things like language concerns, unless it is completely illegible. This is something that we will already have checked for. And you shouldn't be rejecting for something where a lot of people will reject using the word it's not novel enough, because this can be quite confusing to authors exactly what novelty actually means. So PLOS does not reject for novelty. We reject if it doesn't present any advance, but it can be an incremental advance. We don't reject for null information either, null studies either. So we have a nice little guide here for editors where we have what to proceed for review for and what to reject for review for. So if you feel like there is a serious methodological flaw which you can identify before review, then there's no point sending this to reviewers, as long as you can identify this in your decision letter and make it clear to the authors that's the reason to reject. We would absolutely support you rejecting before review for that reasons. And we've got other examples of different reasons why you might reject before review where it doesn't meet the publication criteria. I'm just moving back through this thing. So if you do proceed going towards peer review for PLOS 1 and for PLOS Climate and Water as well, we require to have at least one external reviewer, but we do prefer to have two. If you do decide to proceed towards review, that is the sort of number of reviewers that you should be getting for your reports. Now, the main take-home point, I suppose, to take from the last take-home point for this slide is to remember that you are the expert. We will support the decisions you make. If you feel a manuscript is not in line with our criteria and there are field-specific expectations, then this is something that we would support you taking a decision before the review process, or again, after the review process as well. And you can always get in touch with us if you have concerns that you're not sure whether or not something is suitable to review. One thing that a lot of people get confused about is whether or not there are other concerns that should be that they should be as editors looking for. So one thing that people often think is that they need to look for data availability issues, ethics issues. These are things that we do throughout the peer review process. It's not on you to have to do that. Now, if you do notice it, we are happy and very, very happy for this to be brought up to us, but your main focus is on evaluating the scientific validity of the paper that's been sent to you and whether or not that could or shouldn't go towards review. So, presuming that you have sent it to review, the next step is finding and securing reviewers. So, as a reminder, you need to get at least one external reviewer. This is preferably two for PLOS 1 and PLOS Water and Climate, and that needs to be done before accepting the manuscript at the end stage. So anything that gets published on PLOS 1 and PLOS Water and Climate will have had at least one external reviewer, preferably two. And we do have a helpful link here about going through and securing reviewers. So on the page here, it gives a bunch of information about how to find suitable reviewers for different topics. The first thing I want to highlight is that it seems to go without saying a bit, but they should have suitable expertise. Now, more and more we get papers come in which are interdisciplinary studies where you might have something, for example, on machine learning, but it's also studying forest fires, for example, and you're not likely to find people who have both of those expertise. So you should try and find reviewers that cover both of those, so perhaps a computer scientist to cover the methodological aspect of constructing that machine learning algorithm, but then perhaps someone who studies forest fires to know if that is something that is actually relevant to the field of forest fires. Now, that is something that's more and more happening in the age of AI, where we're having lots of studies doing that. And you're very rarely going to have people that cover every single expertise. So making sure that you can cover the expertise of the paper without just a single reviewer is sometimes very important. The second thing to note is that PLOS aims for unbiased peer review. And what we mean by that is that we're trying to avoid anything that can be perceived as a competing interest. And this is all explained here. Now, Dina's already mentioned some of this. When you're searching for reviewers, you need to make sure that they don't work at the same institution of any of the authors, and that they're not listed in the opposed reviewers from the authors themselves as well, because they may have good reason why they oppose those people reviewing their paper. And something that does vary between different journals. So if you're on an editorial board for another journal, this is important to keep in mind for PLOS's criteria, is that we aim for people to not review papers who have collaborated or published with the authors within the last 5 years. And you can check on this through your own networks, but also on Google Scholar, you can search people's names and see if they've worked together in the same publications recently. And we're also looking to try and find that they're not at the same institution as the reviewer. Something else to keep in mind is that we prefer not to have all the reviewers from the same institution, particularly if they are also from your institution too, to try and keep that element of unbiased peer review. Now, in terms of actually finding reviewers, there's a number of different things here we have for what reviewers can be qualified for. So generally, we're wanting people to be experts in their topic, so evidence that they've published a number of papers and recently, preferably as corresponding or last author, and that they've got expertise in the methodology and that they are, qualified to do so. So people who are postdocs or higher having an equivalent degree to be able to look into that and evaluate the paper appropriately. Now, that is actually, so that's obviously the background of what the reviewers are. In terms of actually finding reviewers, we've got a few tips which are on this page as well. So we have sort of this three-step process. If you start with the reviewers that you know through your networks, they're far more likely to respond to you. So they're going to respond to you quite quickly, and you can also get in touch with them saying, hello, this paper is on your topic, could you please review that? But obviously we know that reviewer fatigue is a really, really big thing at the moment in publishing. So if you're unable to find any that you know, then researchers whose work you know, or maybe colleagues of people that you know, will also be more likely to be quickly responsive to your reviewer invites. And then we have a broader search that you can do where you can be using tools such as Web of Science and Google Scholar, and to try and if you're unable to find reviewers from the list that you have that you've already gone through in the first two steps of those. Now, in terms of like physically inviting reviewers, a lot of misconception is that you have to follow up on all of these yourself. A lot of this is automated within Editorial Manager. So when you've invited a reviewer, the Editorial Manager will email them to let them know that they've been invited, and then it will follow up with them until an expiry for that invitation is sent, so you don't have to follow up with them. And once they've accepted, it will also let them know when it's due, and it will follow up with them as well after that, letting them know that it's overdue, and it will expire as well after a certain period of time. So one thing to emphasize is that once you have front-loaded the actual invitation of the reviewer, so if you were to invite a number at the beginning, we recommend around 8, you don't need to then keep looking into that until those invitations have expired. So this stops them from being harassed by constant emails that are never ending. The system sorts that for them, but it also means that you don't have to, that's not a huge workload for you to keep having to check up yourself. This is all done by the system. Obviously, if everyone says no or all of them expired, you would then need to go and keep inviting newer reviewers. But this is where you can schedule reviewers as well. So you can have your initial batch of reviewers, and then you can schedule alternate reviewers if they then decline. So you could front load that work such that you may not need to see this again for a little bit of time until all of those expires. Now, if we go back to the slides. Now, the last thing to go through is assessing your reviews. And this is, I think, where most of the questions come up, and it's also where I will be speaking to editors most. So there are some papers that editorially the internal staff will keep an eye on for one reason or another, whether or not it's publication ethics concerns or because it's a particularly sensitive topic. We want to make sure it's getting everything it needs before that would go out there and receives good review. Once you have a manuscript that's received as reports, it may be ready to make a decision. And I want to emphasize it may be ready to make a decision because you may open the reports and find that some of the reviews are unfocused or they're quite brief and they haven't assessed the manuscript. So in those cases, if you feel like it's ready to make a decision, we'll go into that in a moment. But if you feel like it's not ready to have a decision, the review reports haven't covered it enough, you are absolutely welcome to and encouraged to invite more reviewers or provide your own comments as well. Now, we do have a couple of guides here on how we can assessing different review reports and making decisions, but also we'll touch a little bit on publication ethics as well and things that you can do to help out maintain a ethical publishing process. So in terms of assessing reviews and decisions, we have a number of, we have an information page for editors here where our reviewer forms are generally mirroring our publication criteria. So I spoke about our criteria for publication here. What reviewers get, and when they fill in, essentially the form they fill in mirrors that publication criteria, which should make it really simple to assess, in the reviewer's opinion, whether or not they thought it met PLOS's publication criteria. Now, you might find that reviewers all disagree with each other, or some issue major revisions, some issue minor revisions, and some say reject, or some say accept. And this is completely normal. Science is supposed to be a debate, so you'll probably have a range of different scenarios of where different reviewers raise different concerns. Now, your role as editor is to decide what does and doesn't need responding to. Now, something I want to emphasize is you should never really edit the reviewer's reports. If you have concerns about a reviewer report for one reason or another, perhaps they have requested citations that you think are irrelevant, or perhaps you think that they have used artificial intelligence tools to generate their review rather than actually conducting a thorough review. These are things you can escalate to us as the editorial staff to look into further, or you can note in a decision letter as well, saying that these citations are to be ignored. This is something that's really helpful, but if you raise it to us, it can help us prevent the practice from becoming prolific as well. But that doesn't mean you would edit the letter. So we really want to say strictly, don't edit the letter, escalate it to us, and then we'll deal with it from there. But you can use your expertise to instruct in the letter, because there is an editor's comment section where you can say, reviewer one's comments on this are particularly important, but you don't need to respond to these, or vice versa. Reviewer two's comments are particularly important, you don't need to respond to these. Or you can add your own information as well if you feel like there are things that both reviewers have missed. And essentially, we're just trying to make sure that as editors, you're helping the paper meet the publication criteria. So it may be that reviewers ask for too much or don't ask for enough. And this is absolutely fine for you to ask for more or point to the right bits that they need to, that the authors need to address. Something else to point towards as well is this, so in the slides there was a second link, and that gives us some information on publication ethics for editorial board members. So this is a 6-page document, so I'm not going to go through all of it at the moment, but it does give you a nice little table of different things to look out for as an editor about issues that we might face. I already mentioned citation stacking, so I'm sure many of you will have seen these in the past where authors or reviewers or editors may put in their reviewer report saying, please cite my papers. This is a really inappropriate practice because citation requests shouldn't be, publication shouldn't be beholden to people trying to inflate their citation metrics. It should be about the integrity of the paper and the scientific quality of the paper. So if you do spot that, that's something in particular to look out for. But also if you notice that in the time, obviously we perform a bunch of checks at the beginning of the process about whether or not a paper's already been published. But if authors have, for one reason or another, submitted it somewhere else, it may appear online during the review process, and as you're an expert in your field, you've already noticed that. This is something else you can escalate to us if you find that actually there's been a duplicate submission and they've submitted somewhere else and it's already online and this shouldn't be published. So again, this is something else to keep an eye out for, but we do conduct these checks ourselves throughout the peer review process. So going back to assessing reviewer feedback. Sorry. Sorry. There are a number of different options where for the one water and climate journals, you could either issue a major revision, a minor revision, an accept or a reject, and this will depend on the stage that you're at. And as I said before, to emphasize that you don't have to agree with the reviewer's decisions. They're there to inform you, and you can use your expertise to then take the decision that you do. So if the reviewers say to accept, but you feel there is more to be addressed, you can still issue a revision decision. And if you feel the reviewer's concerns actually warrant rejection, even though they haven't said to reject, if the content of their report means that you don't feel the paper meets criteria, you can go ahead and reject, provided that you flag this to the authors as the reason that you have rejected. So a major revision is where you're going to have, if you can go through all of these, we've got these lovely little plus and minus symbols where this goes into a bit more depth. If you feel like with a major revision that it may not be accepted in the next round, there are really fundamental things to address, but it's not so fundamental, it should be rejected. A major revision is a really useful thing to signpost that a lot of work still needs doing. A minor revision should only really be used when you think that this is likely to be accepted in the following round. So a minor revision is really small aspects of the process. They're not fundamental and it probably already meets most of the publication criteria, but there are 1 or 2 tweaks that need to be addressed. Obviously, reject should only be done if you feel like it doesn't meet publication criteria and, importantly, couldn't meet publication criteria, or that the work required to make it meet PLOS's publication criteria is too substantial for a simple revision. That's a really important point to mention as well. If this is going to take more than 6 months for the authors, it is unfair to give them a revision decision that's going to take so long where at the end of the day it should be a reject and resubmit because they are going to have to do too much work and the paper may fundamentally change. In terms of an accept decision, this should be done once you're satisfied it meets PLOS publication criteria. And as we said before, to highlight, this should only happen with at least one external reviewer, preferably two, and more if needed, particularly on those interdisciplinary topics that we have. So in terms of going through if you've issued a decision, you've issued a major revision decision, or perhaps you issued a minor revision, you're going to have what we call the R1 stage after the authors resubmit. So they'll revise the paper, they'll hopefully respond to all of the reviewer comments, they'll provide a track changes document that should make it really easy for you to assess whether or not the authors have addressed all of those concerns. So if you receive an R1 manuscript, if you think that the revised manuscript is fine, you can issue an accept decision. If you think that the manuscript, if you're unsure for any reason, or you think that perhaps additional reviewer input is needed, then you should send it back to the reviewers if they're available. If they're not available, but you still think it definitely needs reviewer input, you can invite other reviewers. Just because the original reviewers aren't available doesn't necessarily mean that it should be accepted. If you think that there are still outstanding issues, or importantly, you're not sure whether it's ready, then it should still go to other experts who are available to make sure that the scientific process is protected in that. If you feel, and this is a really important point, that the authors have not responded adequately to the comments, you can issue a rejection in that scenario if you can, again, point to reasons relating to our publication criteria as to why it should be rejected. And that's the point really to hammer home most throughout the how to do a assessing reviewer comments is when a reject decision is issued, if a author feels that it wasn't very clear to them the reasons why it's rejected, quite often it can lead to an appeal. And if the decision wasn't clear, then it may end up coming back and forth until the authors have been given a clear reason to why it's been rejected. And that's just good service for the authors to make sure that they're able to conduct their science and improve their science, but also it helps reduce the workload for us as editors and for you as editors for this not to be coming back and forth. Now, in terms of writing a decision letter, a really good decision letter, as we said, is providing good and constructive feedback, but really importantly is to point specifically to our publication criteria. And I can't emphasize enough how helpful it is to point directly back to our publication criteria. So you can link to this page, you can link to each one of these points and say that actually as PLOS's publication criteria is that everything is described in great detail in terms of the experiments and you haven't met that because of this. That would be a really helpful decision letter and other things such as that. And this is particularly important for reject decisions because, as I said, this can result in appeals if this doesn't end up giving them a clear reason for why it was rejected. And with that, I think that is the end of what I'm talking about, Dina. I will also say, actually, before I finish that bit, I will say is that we generally aim for no more than 2 rounds of revision. But obviously, if you feel that the manuscript is nearly there, we encourage greater rounds of revision. If you feel like the manuscript is getting to R3, R4 at this point, you should consider whether or not the authors are able to respond to the reviewer comments, or the other way around, whether or not it's possible that reviewers may be intentionally holding this up during review, because that can be another example of poor publishing practice. And you can always bring these concerns to us and we can look into it for you. Cool, I think that's that. I shall attempt to stop sharing, but it's the floating meeting controls are gone. So are you able to take that back off of me, Dina?
I think so. Replace current share. Yeah, it looks like I can. All right. Cool. Thank you, Daniel, for going through all of that. And I just want to wrap up by quickly saying that we know that this was a lot of information. And like I mentioned before, you might be at any stage of your manuscript handling experience. So all of the resources that we covered today are going to be found on the Editor Center. So the link is here. And as I mentioned, I'll be sharing these slides out. And I also put this link into the chat itself, so you should be able to explore. So this is what the home page looks like, and you're going to have your role, and then all of the guides that we covered are going to be here under the academic editor section. Policies that we referenced, and then also very helpful, we have this frequently asked questions. So that's something else that you can explore if you run into any situations that you're unsure about. So those kind of address the common things that we typically receive. And with that, I'm actually going to move us into Q&A. I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can see each other a little bit. If you want to ask a question, feel free to come off camera, raise your hand first. There were a couple questions submitted ahead of time that I want to cover first. So Mateo asked in the chat that they've received a paper invitation that looks like some of the references were generated by AI and probably fabricated. Is that enough to reject the paper?
I can take that. So if the authors have, we expect all authors to declare whether or not they've used AI in the generation of their manuscript or in the editing of their manuscript. They're not allowed to generate a whole manuscript utilizing AI tools. They should be using it at most to edit and augment their work that they've already done. Now, this sometimes can be accidental on the author's part if they've been trying to format things and it has, for whatever reason, fabricated some references, but they should be checking this. In this case, I would escalate it to the journal to have a look at this. But if you have note, and I would include your escalation to the journal to say these references don't exist, because then we can take action and look into whether or not it's a broader pattern of behavior as well. But in all likelihood, we would, as an editorial office, reject, but I would escalate it to us because it's extremely helpful for us to be able to be monitoring situations like this.
Okay, and then Tobit says, is there a maximum timeline for a manuscript review after 2 or 3 revisions or more?
As I said at the end that we aim for no more than 2 rounds of revision, but that's not it's not fixed. If you feel like there is no real maximum limit in the sense that if there are things to be addressed and it looks like it's nearly there, it can be done. We just try and restrict it because it's a lot of there's administrative process if nothing else, resubmitting to the system and moving it through the system. But if the paper is nearly at accept and you're on the 3rd round of revision, I wouldn't reject because it's got to the 4th round, if that makes sense. I would probably escalate it to the editorial office again to say this. I feel it's basically there. Is there anything that actually needs doing? Because the reviewer keeps requesting revisions, for example.
Okay, and then Brittany asks, do I declare being on the editorial board as a conflict of interest when submitting a manuscript to another journal in the PLOS family? There is a question at submission to declare whether you have a previous association with PLOS. It's not necessarily a conflict of interest. You're absolutely allowed to, as an editorial board member, submit to the journal that you're on or another of the PLOS journals. So it's helpful, but not mandatory. Okay, and then Xingyu says, what if the reviewer extends the review timeline several times without any feedback? How long shall I wait maximally? This is a great question. Everybody's pressed for time. So you'll see the default in Editorial Manager is going to be 10 days. You do have control over that within reason, of course. Like you're not going to extend it to like 6 months. We recommend no more than 21 days, so 3 weeks. The reviewers can also request an extension. So the journal office will automatically grant extensions, I believe, up to 2 weeks. Any longer than that, and we'll write to you as the handling editor to approve whether that reviewer should be granted that extension or not. So it's kind of like a use your best judgment situation if they're asking for an incredibly long timeline. You kind of just have to weigh, like, are they going to be really critical as a reviewer, or can I get their expertise maybe through another reviewer or not? But it depends. Okay, and then Mohammed says most of the time when I download articles from PLOS One, the figures are not embedded within the text and are typically placed at the end of the paper, making the peer review process more difficult. Do you have any suggestions? Yes, this is very like a weird quirk of editorial manager. So the figures are always at the bottom of the manuscript PDF, and they're typically very low resolution. And it's not intuitive, but on the actual page where the figure should be present within the manuscript, you'll see a little hyperlink in the top, I believe it's in the top right corner. And if you click on that hyperlink, the full resolution figure will be present. So they're there, it's just kind of buried. I believe they're also, I don't know, Daniel, do you know, are they in the figure files as well?
So they will be in the second round, but they're not required at the initial submission. So in the second round, in an R1, for example, the authors should be uploading this separately as part of the checks, but I believe. But it's again, as you say, a quirk of editorial manager and how it ends up working out in the first round.
Yeah. Again, yes, the journal office can help facilitate any of those things. If reviewers are really struggling, encourage them to contact the journal office, and we can attach them in email or otherwise facilitate them navigating editorial manager so they can see the full resolution images. And then Tobit asks, are there any benefits towards publication like a waiver or rebate for being an editorial board member when submitting a manuscript to the PLOS family? So the direct answer to that is no, there isn't a specific discount code for being an editorial board member. PLOS is a nonprofit and our editorial board is just far too large for us to financially support that. But we do have a number of options to support APC discounts. So we do have a publication fee assistance program that editorial board members are absolutely eligible to apply for. So I think it's plos.org/fees where you can explore all of the different offers that we have. We also have an institutional partnerships program. So it's very much worth figuring out also on the plos.org website, whether the institution that you work at or any of your co-authors are part of an institution that already has an agreement with PLOS. And those agreements vary between full publication cost coverage to discounts. So definitely explore that as an option to support the article processing fees. Let's see, Mohammed, I have difficulty finding reviewers from the database. How can I resolve this issue? And many of them lack reviewing experience. Okay, this is a really great question as well. So the PLOS database is uncurated. I do not encourage anyone to be using that as the main source of securing reviewers, which of course is very counterintuitive because it's there in the system. But anyone can register as a reviewer or potential reviewer themselves, but anyone who's also an academic editor can also proxy review people. So there's people in there that may not even have a working email. So it's not a particularly reliable source of identifying reviewers with suitable expertise. So what I do encourage you to do, as Daniel went over, is to use an external database. So the PubMed is a great one, Google Scholar, whatever your preferred database is, find somebody with relevant expertise. And because PLOS has a lot of people in the database, once you find their email from the corresponding authorship on a manuscript that they've published, look them up in Editorial Manager, and more often than not, they're already in the database, and then you can send the invitation from there. So I wouldn't necessarily encourage using the database itself as a primary source. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Daniel?
No, I need to say that. I meant to say that as I was going through and missed that bit. But yes, um, if you have their name, you can search it in the system. And hopefully, it's there. But it's also if you it may even be easier to find their details outside the system, just of how editorial manager works. Sometimes people can list multiple emails within the same account, which means that searching their email doesn't always work because of the string of letters that is there. So once you have their information, if you can't find it in EM, that doesn't mean that it's not there. But it may be easier to find up-to-date information elsewhere as well.
That's true. The only exception to that would be the Web of Science Reviewer Locator tool, which is a plugin that we have embedded within Editorial Manager. So when you go to the Invite Reviewers screen, there's a tab along the top, and you'll see it there, the Web of Science Reviewer Locator. And that is an external database connection that will source potential reviewers from the Web of Science database, and it'll suggest up to 30 names based on the manuscript that you're handling. Couple of things to note in there, those people are not necessarily already in the database, so you might need to add them in, and there's a quick little button to do that there. The other thing is they're not vetted already. So you'll need to check. You'll need to double check. Just because Web of Science, the tool has suggested the reviewer, you still need to look into their background and whether they are actually on topic and suitable to potentially review the manuscript. That would be the only other suggestion there. Let's see. What if the reviewer hasn't submitted the review information for a long time? Is there a time limit? Xiang asked that question. There isn't. It kind of just depends, like on whether that reviewer has been invited recently or has wanted to contribute. I would say take the um, statistics that are associated with a reviewer profile with a grain of salt and not weigh your decision to invite them too heavily on that. It could be that, for example, somebody's a very senior researcher and they've been invited 20 times and have only agreed once. And so you might think, oh, well, this person isn't really keen on reviewing, but maybe the paper that you're sending them might be something that's totally in their wheelhouse and they get very excited about it and they want to review. So use your best judgment there. They may also, a senior reviewer may invite their graduate student to help them do the review, which we absolutely encourage. And there's even a field on the review form to say if you had help with that review. So it's kind of like a situationally dependent, but in direct answer to your question, no, there's no time limit for the last time that they submitted a review.
I would also just add the co-reviewing is really I found really helpful as a PhD student. I don't know, it's a great exercise. So if you know people who are too busy and you would email them saying we'd encourage you to co-review if you know they have PhD students because it is just a really helpful tool as a PhD student to learn how to critique papers and go through them. They also tend to be the people who give incredibly detailed, albeit sometimes harsh, reviewer reports. But it's a great learning tool and a great part of the scientific process. So I wouldn't be discouraged by just because someone is quite busy that they could be presiding over someone else helping do the report too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we had one question submitted ahead of time that I wanted to make sure we got to. So the question was, how does PLOS One ensure consistency and fairness in editorial decisions across highly interdisciplinary submissions?
Yes, I thought about this a lot actually, and it says I mentioned a couple of times throughout that more and more where we're getting easier access to machine learning and artificial intelligence tools, people conduct cross-disciplinary things where it's a computer science method, but it tends up they're assessing MRI images or diseases on leaves or things like that, and it's these people are unlikely to be in the same field, but it does require both to be assessed. Occasionally, you'll see things in the information for editor box on the details page where we highlight that this is a multidisciplinary study. And this will point something towards you to try and have an idea in mind that you might want to try and invite people from different aspects of the methodology. The other thing is occasionally we will monitor some of these papers ourselves to make sure that we can give prompts as well. But the best thing that we can do is in these webinars like this is give instructions to the editorial board to keep in mind that highly interdisciplinary topics require different types of reviewers and may exceed the 2 or 3 reviewers that you may be thinking of typically just because you want to cover all aspects of that. If that's helpful.
Okay, then Tobit asked a follow-up question. What is the cause that says that a reviewer must have a PhD? Can we still give a PhD student invite to review based on, Daniel, what you just said?
So I would say that the invitation would go in this instance to the person who would be doing leading the co-review. So that would be the PI or the supervisor of the PhD student, but that you can put in a review invite to encourage that. This also, if you know them as well, you can put in a letter and say, "Hello, I know that you're busy, but could you consider a co-review where you lead it and you submit it, but the PhD student does the bulk of the report." So in my case, I ended up writing, I think, 8 pages of reviewer comments, and my supervisor wrote a paragraph summarizing their thoughts and a bit of mine. It was a good learning process to be more concise. But no, it's you would invite the person in charge, and they would then work with their students and submit it under their account, but ensuring that they are declaring that it is a code review, which we have the option for in the system.
Right, that was the end of our submitted questions. We have a few more minutes. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, I'm going to then just wrap us up here. Go back to my shared screen really quickly. And all right, the last thing that we want to say is, as you've heard throughout our presentation, that please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We have on our Editor Resource Center this Contact Your Journal page where you can see all of the various websites for the journals to read more about the scope and the criteria for publication, as well as all of the different journal emails. So those are the best place to email if you have a question about a particular manuscript that you're handling. We are on social media if you're on social media. We post all types of content there. And then the last bit about you being a PLOS ambassador. So this is if you're at a conference or you're receiving feedback or giving feedback about the particular journal that you're on the editorial board member, that you're on the editorial board of, excuse me. We always want to hear that feedback as well from the community and what's going on out there. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording at this time.